the images coming in which seem to show the continual back and forth between two peoples who've been not able to find a compromise now for more than 60 years. But the latest source of friction is all about something called settlements. We've got some live pictures we can show you. This is what it looks like right now over Gaza. And we've been monitoring these for, the better part of the last couple of hours. And from time to time, we've seen the flak, right? The anti-aircraft gunfire going into the sky. It really illuminates the sky as the Palestinian defenses try and combat against the Israeli warships that have been hitting this area. It's continued for quite some time. John Huddy, interestingly enough, our own John Huddy, he worked for years as a network correspondent. He was based in Jerusalem, and he's reporting today on the latest overnight fighting between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
2 Israelis have been killed and at least 26 Palestinians, including reportedly 9 children in Gaza, as the cross-border fighting intensifies in what has been the most intense escalation of fighting since 6 days of cross-border fire in November 2019. In Israel, 2 women were killed when a rocket hit their apartment building in the city of Ashkelon, just north of the Gaza Strip. More than 400 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel since Monday, as Israel continues to launch airstrikes on targets in Gaza. The IDF, Israel Defense Forces, says it has struck 130 quote-unquote military targets in Gaza, according to a military spokesperson, mostly belonging to Hamas. The IDF says 90% of the rockets that penetrated the Gaza-Israeli border were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. At least 122 people, meanwhile, have been reportedly injured in Israel since Monday. All this as the protests and violence also continues in East Jerusalem and the Old City, where the clashes started about a month ago when Israeli residents in a neighborhood of East Jerusalem received a court order to evict 6 Palestinian families. While that case plays out in court, the violence only increased the past month, ultimately erupting to the point we're seeing now, fueled by political instability in both Israel and the West Bank. And the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, says about 90%, by the way, of the rockets fired from Gaza into Israel are intercepted by what's called the Iron Dome rocket defense system. And as the fighting continues, Rick, Israel is calling up 5,000 reserve soldiers, as Egypt is now reportedly engaged in intensive talks with Israel and also Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza to try, the big keyword, try and broker a ceasefire, possibly something as soon as Wednesday. But that said, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the fact that rockets from Gaza were aimed at Jerusalem crossed a quote-unquote red line, and that Israel, he said, would attack in response with increased strength and frequency. Rick?
John Huddy reporting for us on that situation that continues even as we speak in Gaza between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you so much, John. Joining us now, Miko Paulette, who's an Israeli author who argues for Palestinian rights. Also joining us is Alan Grayson, who's a former congressman from Florida, who argues in defense of Israelis' defense policies. My thanks to both of you for being with us. You come at this from conflicting points of view. Alan, let me start with you. The conversation really is a lot about settlements. The Israelis say, look, they're evictions. The Palestinians say, no, they're not. They're people being forced off of their own land. How would you characterize it?
I don't think that it makes a difference. What matters are the facts, not the words that we use to describe them. I think it's fair to say that the Israelis have been aggressive in trying to clear land for settlers for many years. What's most important at this particular moment is that this conflict is occurring right at the time when the most inclusive government in Israeli history was about to be formed. And I have to think that extremists on both sides are doing everything they can to prevent this unity of government from being formed. And that's why we're seeing what we are seeing today.
Miko, what do you make of that? The fact that, we're not going to get in an argument, Alan suggests, about what words we call it, whether they're being forced off their land or they're being evicted, that we really need to look at is the fact that we have the potential to form a government that's actually going to be able to help the Palestinians.
That's utter nonsense. I don't know what he's talking about, but he knows what he's talking about. Benjamin Netanyahu flared this up. He wanted this violence because he knows that this is his way to lead what's called a national unity government. And it makes a great deal of difference what words we use here. Israel, like you said in the introduction, has been engaged in ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. In other words, kicking out Palestinians from their lands, from their homes, and settling those homes and that land with Israeli settlers. That's exactly what is happening in Jerusalem. The fact that it is happening during the month of Ramadan, they've escalated the violence, they've escalated the ethnic cleansing. I have friends who live in Sheftorah, Palestinian friends, two professors who have lived there their entire lives. They are slated to be kicked out. Rockets from Gaza just fell in the neighborhood of my mother's house, and I'm looking at the pictures as we see them on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Words matter a great deal here. It's all about the words. It's all about the fact that even Human Rights Watch came out and said that what Israel is doing is apartheid. It's apartheid. It's ethnic cleansing. Netanyahu on purpose is flaring the situation because it's good for politics. He doesn't care about the bloodshedding. And the reality is that people in Gaza, and people in Jerusalem, and people throughout the entire country, Palestinians throughout the entire country, are feeling the solidarity with what has happened in Jerusalem and going into Al-Aqsa Mosque and shooting and using stun grenades and injuring and shooting people during worship. These are crimes that are well defined, and we need to use the right words because these people are going to have to see their day in court.
Let's give Alan a chance to chime in here. Alan, is it difficult at times to defend Israelis' actions because they do appear, certainly image-wise, to be extremely aggressive? And let's face it, the Palestinians seem like David here compared to a Goliath, to use a biblical phrase.
Well, Rick, it's difficult to defend Israel against the kind of crazy talk that we just heard from your other guest. To compare what's happened in the West Bank to, quote, ethnic cleansing is incredibly irresponsible. All the settlers together occupy less than 10% of the West Bank. Think about the actual incidents of ethnic cleansing that we've seen historically, like Armenia, and compare that to what's happening now in Israel. And it's almost criminal to talk about it that way. And when you're talking about it with such extreme terms, then yes, that words do start to matter because you're vilifying an entire people. You're vilifying the people of Israel, which isn't the first time that that's happened. So with regard to your question, Rick, listen, I agree with Israel whenever Israel's right. Just like when I was in Congress, I agree with President Obama whenever President Obama was right. And that's it. That's as far as I go. But I think that there's a real danger in trying to turn people against an entire culture and against an entire nationality like your guest is trying to do against Israel right now.
You make it sound, he says, Miko, like the Israelis are just by nature evil people. Like you're demonizing them the way some argue they might try and demonize Palestinians. How do you respond to Alan's accusation against you?
Well, the difference between he and I is that I'm actually from there. I've seen in the game. My father was a general, and my grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So when I talk about Zionism, and when I talk about Israel as a state, and when I talk about Israeli society, I actually know what I'm talking about. I'm not just being paid by AIPAC or some other Israeli lobby in order to speak these lies. The reality is that the state of Israel has been the aggressor for over 7 decades. In fact, it was the aggressor before it was established. It was established as a result of Zionist aggression in Palestine. That's why we have 4 or 5 million Palestinians living in refugee camps because of the ethnic cleansing that he doesn't want to, the word that he doesn't want to use. The fact is that Human Rights Watch and other international organizations have recognized that Israel is an apartheid state because the words matter, because these crimes are well defined in international law, and the ICC found that there's grounds for investigating Israel for war crimes. Words matter, these crimes are well defined, and I know what I'm talking about because I have skin in the game, because I'm from there, because my family was involved in creating that state. So I know what I'm talking about. I didn't learn this in some college course. And the reality of the problem is being flared up by Netanyahu.
Miko, what about and if you could keep your answer to 30, because I want to give Alan the last word, but what about the rocket fire into Israel that the Palestinians have been doing and did last night, by the way? Some 30-some Israelis were apparently injured.
Yeah, well, you know what? The spokesman for the State Department said that
that America recognizes the right of people for self-defense. They have a right to defend themselves. They have a right to do this. What the Palestinians are doing from Gaza is classic self-defense. They're trying to defend Jerusalem. They're trying to defend Alexa. They're trying to defend their friends and their families who live in Jerusalem are being thrown out of their homes. And this is what they're doing. But you can't compare that to the enormous amount of violence that's being used by Israel and the mass murder that Israel is committing in Gaza over and over again.
What do you expect the Biden administration will do, Alan, in this situation? What should they do? What would you counsel them to do?
What they have done, they've condemned the terrorism. Some people in Jerusalem are being forced out of their homes. That's being countered with missile attacks against civilian populations and literal terrorism. People throughout South Israel and now other parts of Israel live in terror because of these fanatics. And if you want to relitigate what happened in 1948, that's one thing. But if you want to talk about what's happening today, the Palestinians are wrong, wrong, wrong. You do not launch missiles at civilian populations, period.
Miko, Alan, my thanks to you both. Good debate, smart and passionate. We appreciate it. This is the news with Rick Sanchez, and when we